Hey there YouTube, I'm Ikitsu, this is the Ikitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Age of Wonders Planetfall. So today we're going to be talking about the Vanguard Voidtech combination, the one that I think is actually a little bit overrated. It is really quite strong in some ways, but there's a lot of things that just don't really work very well. So anyway, let's start by diving straight into the elements of this, which are a little bit more economical. So first of all, we get access to Echo Protocols and the preventative surveillance. Echo Protocols is not an early game tech, which makes it a shame that it is the one that unlocked a bit earlier. It gives you an extra +1 to resources for every one that's working in that resource. So if I have a person working in food, I get 1 extra food. This is weaker, technically speaking, than the production/cash bonus that you get as the synthesis, and it's weaker than the bonus that you get from the Prometheans, but it is more flexible. It doesn't give you as much direct resources, but it does give you more access to different types of resources. Personally speaking, I would rather get the 2, but this also is actually a pretty okay bonus there. The major problem with it is that you aren't going to get much utility out of it by the time you get it. You're not going to get much utility out of it until you've got like fairly big cities. Up until then, things like the frontier survival are much stronger, and even things like colonial militia. And if we go into this sort of thing here, we could look at doctrines. You're going to actually want to get something like the builder or the economist early game rather than the Echo Protocols in the early game. It is good once you've got bigger cities that have got more resources, especially as food becomes less important in the later game. Like if we look over here at Westrig over here, this city does not really need food anymore all that much, so we could definitely cut it off there, and we would be getting +22 resources instead of +15. So it would also be in resources that we would want rather than the ones that we just sort of get by default there. So it's a very late game bonus. You're going to be relying more on the Vanguard and quest-based ones in the early game. On the other hand, preventative surveillance is I think it's a PvP sort of thing there. This one gives you better ability to scout and survey the sort of surroundings, which is pretty okay against the AI, but I would argue that this is one of those ones that really helps you prevent a cheese strat from like a real player. If you sort of have a bunch of stuff coming in to try and rush you, especially in that sort of situation, you would probably want to have some scouts going around with the bonus sensors there. Adding preventative surveillance on that as well would make it so that those guys are really good at finding those sorts of things coming towards you. So I think that that's sort of what they're for. Next up, you get access to Quantum Leap, and Quantum Energy Tapping is where you're starting to see something that's really powerful. This is, again, a late game bonus, though. Plus 20% to energy. Obviously, if you don't have a good energy production, plus 20% is not going to add very much to that, but plus 20% is a very large amount to be getting. So you can absolutely always sort of rely on this one to get you that sort of big energy boost in the mid-late game. I think that this one's going to be just absolutely vital to your sort of later game there, especially once a lot of those Vanguard operations are starting to wane in terms of how effective they are. Quantum Leap also gives you the Quantum Project one. This one's a lot more situational and I think a lot worse than the other one. Plus 15 science flat for each colony and for every research sector linked to it. Obviously, each colony can only have 2 sectors devoted to research linked to it, and unfortunately, you're probably only going to be seeing like maybe 4 or 5 colonies, and you're probably only going to be having like maybe 6, or maybe you could have potentially a little bit more. But ultimately, you're not getting a humongous amount of extra research out of the Quantum Project. Situationally, you might get a very good amount there, and also it would let you sort of move everyone out of science jobs and into other types of jobs, so it could help you in that sort of sense there. I think that's a bit of a sort of a weaker one, but there are some uses to it, so don't ignore it. If it's something that you've got lots of, you could definitely sort of pump out a bunch of extra science through using the Quantum Project there. Both these are a bit more mid-late game. I would say that the problem with the Quantum Project is that because it's sort of smaller flat bonuses, it just isn't really sort of hitting that sort of massive amount that you're getting in terms of the spike from Quantum Energy Tapping. For military, there's not a ton in here that really synergizes well with our base soldier. If we take a look at the mods here, you could theoretically throw the Void augmentation onto your troopers. or your engineers or something like that, this does allow you to apply dimensional instability, but I actually think that dimensional instability is a little bit of a weak status effect there. So the fact that it has a relatively low chance of proccing and the fact that it's a relatively weak disability means that I'm not super impressed by the ability to have a low percent chance to apply it using Void Augmentation. I think that generally speaking, I wouldn't really use this Void Augmentation mod on really much of anything, honestly. Next up, we get access to the Gravity Pulse Grenade. The thing is that our standard trooper does start with a grenade, and even though it's not as good as the Gravity Pulse Grenade, it is still perfectly competent. Generally speaking, your damage per second is going to be higher if you don't use your grenade. Your grenade is more situational for that stagger effect there. So you don't really need to give your trooper a second one, and if you're using units like engineers or whatever, which is the only other unit that you've really got in the standard tech tree that you can use this on, you're really not using your engineers correctly, in my opinion. Next up, though, you've got the Stasis Pocket Inducer. This unfortunately has a very low percent chance, and even if you're looking at your standard trooper, frankly speaking, the Shockwave Infuser is just better. It's got the same percentage chance of acting, but it does concussion, so if it activates once, your opponent is immediately going to lose all of their actions. Whereas with the Stasis Pocket Inducer, you've got the same odds of it happening, but once it happens, all that happens is that unit loses one action point. It's a lot weaker for the same percent chance for the same cost, so just not a very good option for Vanguard because, again, you've got a better option. Now, you could use the Stasis Pocket Inducer if you're going for a laser sort of build there. If you're going for things like tanks and stuff like that, because they don't have the option to take the Shockwave Infuser, so that's when this could potentially apply. It would also be pretty powerful on things like the Tank Corps' overcharged laser cannon and stuff like that. Potentially, you could also use it with the upgraded strike missiles, although I don't, again, think that works necessarily as well on those with their kinetics. Could also use it on something like the drone carrier, maybe. I think that by then you're really going to be better off with the flash module, though, for those sort of laser vehicles, because the odds of it applying is much, much higher. And the effect is pretty similar in the end there. You reduce the odds of them actually hitting with the attacks that they do have instead of reducing the number of attacks that they have, but it's still pretty effective there. The last mod that, oh yeah, there's also the phase drive. This is useful on bikes, which is kind of an, there are some interesting things that you can do with bikes in this one. I just don't particularly like that unit. The main restriction with the phase drive is that it can only be applied to heavy vehicle, or heavy units rather. There's more interesting things that you could do with other factions, I think, with this, but the fact that the bike only has single action attacks does mean that this is actually a pretty useful thing to have on those sort of units there. Lastly, you've got the thing that is actually really good there, the Quantum Avatar. This thing is ridiculous. Anything that attacks you, the attacker gets teleported, which cancels a lot of their other attacks often. It gives them dimensional instability. Notice that it's not a strength chance of applying. It just happens, and that unit becomes staggered. This is an absolutely bonkers ability there. In addition, Voidtech or Voidtech modded units adjacent to this one receive a +3 shields and gain a level of stagger resistance. Now, I didn't actually have a chance to upgrade my units the way I wanted to take full advantage of this, but this does mean that you can use the Quantum Avatar vehicles as miniature sorts of I guess tank sort of things there. In addition to this, you can actually have like swarms of all heavy things that are using Quantum Avatar, and if you do this, you're a monster for one thing, but also it makes it almost impossible to kill that stack off, because they're all just basically going to prevent the enemy from ever attacking properly. It's really gratuitous, it's really gross, and I don't think that it's I think they should have not allowed this to happen as it is here. It is probably the strongest single mod in the game, by far, I'd say. Realistically speaking, this thing synergizes with basically anything you could think of putting this onto. So anyway, onto their actual units. And we can talk as well about the sort of synergy for the Vanguard techs for them as well. So the Echo Walker here. The Echo Walker for the Vanguard have Quantum Pulse instead of the standard one. The only difference between Quantum Pulse and I think it's Echo Pulse is the normal one is that this one has a small chance of it has a small chance of applying dimensional instability to the enemy, and this is actually surprisingly more useful than you'd think. It's rare that it's going to succeed, but if you teleport this unit, the clone directly adjacent to an enemy, there's a small chance that they'll lose 2 points of kinetic resistance. And the reason that that's really meaningful is that that clone then gets its ability to attack there, and that attack also gets a bonus to apply their next level of dimensional instability because they've lost some resistance. So it can help sort of snowball that effect a little bit faster there, and it also means that that initial strike is going to potentially deal a little bit of damage. And it's a low chance, but it's a fairly low tier unit, and it is just a free little bonus there. You could even sort of pop this clone into the middle of like a whole cluster of enemy units there and potentially try to apply it to a whole bunch of them. I don't think that's really necessary. I do think it is a fairly weak distinction, but it's nice that it's got a little bit of a bonus compared to everyone else's version of the Echo Walker there. Now these guys synergize quite nicely with the jetpack, obviously. Like the jetpack is going to just be probably one of the craziest bonuses that you're going to ever get in terms of Vanguard with melee type things. It gives sort of unprecedented mobility to these guys. You can actually have your Vanguard Echo Walker sort of like move up maximum distance, drop the clone at maximum distance, and then have the clone jetpack towards the enemy. It's absolutely crazy. It's a really, really powerful ability for getting towards the enemy backline and stuff like that. And after they've done that, they can still throw their grenades. So it's a really, really sort of useful utility thing there. For melee units, I think that you're always going to want something that prevents stagger. So interlocking armor is going to be something that's a little bit vital for them. If the only exception to this is if you find yourself in like a situation where you know you're not going to be fighting against any other melee units. The reason that this is so important is that stagger resistance is what lets melee units beat other melee units. So take, for example, if I you had a scenario where my melee unit was attacking an enemy one. If I'm immune to stagger and they're not, what happens is I attack them with my melee weapon and stagger them, and then I get my other 2 attacks. So I've attacked 3 times. On their turn, they attack me once, I get to retaliate, stagger them, and then they get to attack me one more time because they lost one of their action points. So I've just attacked 4 times and they've attacked twice. This is how melee units like go from just beating to other melee units to crushing other melee units is through that stagger resistance. Not only that, but Void Walker or Echo Walkers have that ability to apply that dimensional instability. Dimensional instability removes stagger resistance. So if you're up against a similar type of unit, the Echo Walkers can actually beat them if they're lucky enough to apply that stagger, dimensional instability to them. So I think that interlocking armor is just really, really vital to winning those sort of melee versus melee fights there. There's nothing else that I would really say stands out as useful for these guys, but you could theoretically use the miniaturized missile array on them as a replacement for the grenade. This makes them impractically expensive, but it is really, really funny, and also it does fix one of their primary problems in that the Echo Walker has no ability to provide anti-air support. So if you're up against air units, these guys are absolute trash. But if you've got access to the miniaturized missile array, this can attack air units to a certain degree there, meaning that you can actually fight back at least a little bit. You would hate to find like a stack of like 6 Echo Walkers like losing to a single owl drone. That would be just embarrassing. Next up is the phase manipulator. There's some combinations that you can use with this thing, but I don't think this is particularly good for what it is. So this thing's like energy blaster attack is pretty okay, but unfortunately you don't have the ability to improve arc weapons as Vanguard, so it's sort of stuck with what it is there. You could try to upgrade it using the the Voidtech upgrades, but none of them really synergize super well with the energy blaster here. What I would argue is that this is only really going to be good for offense capability if you're up against someone that can't shoot upwards, because this unit's quite fragile. It's got a fairly okay damage rate, like 11 damage on a gun is pretty good in this game, but you can't mod it to make it much better. You're probably taking it for the phase shift abduct and the phase shift evacuate. So abduct gives you the ability to potentially pull an enemy unit towards you. It only has 5 range, which I think is a little bit too short for this type of ability. So what typically happens is you have to move your phase manipulator up towards the enemy so you can pick one of their units that's a little bit exposed that you think is a very high priority target. You pull that from their lines, you focus all of your shots on that unit, and it dies. And then their turn comes comes up and they destroy your phase manipulator. So you're kind of even on that. The only exception to this is if you're able to pull something that's much more key to their composition than your phase manipulator is to yours. You can also use 2 phase manipulators and have one run up to abduct them. Have your army, if they've presumably got enough range, focus that one unit down, kill it, and then you can have another phase manipulator abduct your first phase manipulator. This is a lot of units to do kind of not a terribly great trick. You'd probably be better off with just having better units that can just go up and fight the enemy, I think, under normal circumstances. But it is a trick that you can try to do with the phase manipulator. Beyond that, though, there's not really much in terms of synergy with the Vanguard that can make this thing really tick in a way that's stronger than it normally would be able to. It's just a little bit too fragile, and the mods for Vanguard just really don't work with it. They've got sort of better mods for infantry, in my opinion, as opposed to mods for aerial units there. Lastly, we get the Rift Generator, and this is actually a pretty interesting support unit. The Distortion Rift Coils is kind of an okay attack there. The problem is that it's kinetic damage, but doesn't count as a firearm. If it counted as a firearm, this would actually be a really, really good tank, but it's just kind of okay. In terms of durability, it's not the best there is, but it's not terrible either. What's good about this thing is that it's got the Dimensional Rift and Dimensional Desync abilities here. Dimensional Desync allows this thing to make a unit immune to damage, but also incapable of attacking. So if I had 3 of these guys and my opponents had 3 of whatever, and I decided I didn't like those units being in the fight there, I apply Dimensional Desync to those 3 units. They run off and are invincible. So I ignore them, they ignore them, they can't do anything, they're not in the fight, and I use the rest of my stuff to focus fire down the remaining units. That's what Dimensional Desync is really powerful about. We've also got access to Dimensional Rift, which is a pretty powerful big artillery strike type thing there. The damage isn't that great, but it does have a lot of stagger, and it does have that ability to apply dimensional instability, and it also teleports people off in random directions, which means if they've got a really good cover position, this can be used to potentially not only sort of flip people around out of cover, but it also randomly changes their orientation, allowing you to get interesting flank shots there. The only problem I have with this unit in the general sense is it doesn't actually mesh very well with the with your Echo Walkers. You're going to want to combine this with something that's got a bit of range, in my opinion. So let's take a look at some of the unit combinations that I've sort of gone for here. If I can find my city that I was producing stuff in here. Should be over this way. There we go. Alright, so for our troops, the only problem I've got here is that I want to give these guys a Voidtech module instead of the nanites here. I was going to go with the Stasis Pocket Inducer, but it just never got to that phase of the game there. But you can go for a full offense build and have these guys sort of hiding behind your other heavy units, and they'd get the shields from that and be a little bit more defended as a result of that. They do have to have a Voidtech mod for them to be able to gain the benefits of Quantum Avatar, but as long as they've got one of those mods. Even if they don't, though, nanites in this build is just generically quite decent, even though it doesn't rely at all on Voidtech there. Next up, you've got the ability to get some interesting stuff in the assault bikes here. I didn't bother doing it because I don't particularly like assault bikes, and this is fairly Cosmite heavy. This is actually in a city that has reduced Cosmite cost, so this is all very, very expensive. But you would ideally put a laser module over here, preferably something like maybe the blind one or the stagger one or something like that, depending on what you're up against and what you're trying to do there. But what's special about this is basically that Quantum Avatar makes it so that you really can't kill these bikes. So if you had a full stack of 6 of these guys, they'd sort of be able to sort of zip around the battlefield, and you would not be able to do jack dick all about them. They've got evasive for plus 15% harder to hit there. They've got a lot of armor, they've got a lot of shields, they've got potentially a lot of firepower as well. Like if we just did this one for the damage there, it's 24 damage single shot. Ideally you'd have something like a laser module instead of this thing, but it's a lot of damage for a single shot sort of thing that can apply sort of anywhere. You're pretty much guaranteed to get a flank because you can move full distance, teleport behind them, fire your gun, and then when they try to retaliate against you, their units all stagger themselves. It's just kind of a silly build there. The only problem with it is it's pretty Cosmite intensive, so building full stacks of these guys, and you do sort of want to build full stacks of these guys, because if you don't, they'll just focus fire down all of its supporting units, and then eventually grind this one unit down, which it will get ground down by itself eventually. So that is something you can do with bikes with Voidtech. I think that this works better, of course, if you're in a slower paced game where having that sort of thing would make sense there. I'm on very fast speed, and that means that cosmite efficiency is much more important for me. But then again, if I was playing against real people as well and had more cosmite efficient units, I could have a much larger army and just sort of swamp their theoretically weird tweaked units with a vast sort of thing of units there. Next up's the Pug. You probably don't really need these guys very much with the Voidtech. There's not a lot of interesting tricks you can do with them. You could use it to like reset your Echo Walker, but the thing is you can't actually have more than one Echo Walker out at a time there, or rather Echo Walker clone. If you create one clone and then reset the cooldown and then cast it again, the first clone actually disappears, so it's not a hugely beneficial thing to have running around there. Could use it in conjunction with phase manipulators, but again, like having a whole bunch of random support units that are kind of weak at what they're doing doesn't really fill me with a lot of confidence there, so I'm not super happy about that idea. I already mentioned, not really super happy about the phase manipulator. I think if I wanted to go air with the Vanguard, I would probably actually stick with their standard air unit, not with the phase manipulators. For Echo Walker, early game, you're going to want to go with the just the jetpack and the whatever this is called, the plates, interlocking armor. You can get interlocking armor like right off the bat there, so if you wanted to, you could chuck this onto your starting Echo Walker like right away there, and they'll be pretty durable as a result of that. Especially useful because a lot of the early game critters have kinetic type attacks there, and this makes them more resistant to those as well as the stagger, because a lot of them are also melee. Once you get the jetpack, this is when these things really come to life there. You're going to get a lot more flank attacks, you're going to get a lot more full attacks there. Just a fantastic sort of module to add to these guys. And this is what we end up with a sort of later game there. We just take the basic sort of stuff there and add the gravity pulse grenade. You could also go with the void augmentation. This dramatically increases the chance of them getting their void blades to cause dimensional instability, but I think that the gravity pulse grenade, with its ability to form an AoE attack there with the same odds of dimensional instability as a single swipe using the void augmentation, sort of levels out there as long as you're hitting enough targets with the grenade there. I do think that this is just a really powerful unit, and you're going to be extremely dominant when you're using this combination in the early mid game. Next up is rift generators. I use these guys mostly for support there, and I've got mine with the quantum avatar, the stasis pocket inducer, and the nanite injectors. This makes it so that they're capable of sort of bodyguarding for a lot of your units there, as long as you've remembered to give them a Voidtech module. And also, they're pretty hard to kill. This thing's really annoying to sort of get rid of. The distortion rift coils and the dimension rift are kind of nice attacks there. They're not amazing or anything like that. The stasis pocket inducer, the reason I have to put this on here is because this unit can't take other types of mods. So that's sort of what that's stuck with. Now, this thing's really all about the crowd control, which makes it kind of a shame that I can't add concussive rounds to this thing there. But it's still actually better than a walker, for example, with the concussive rounds, just because Dimensional Rift is really good crowd control, as is Dimensional Desync. Both of those are great ways to sort of make it so that you're only facing a small portion of the enemy at any given time there, and what portion of the army that you are facing off against is heavily disorganized. So I think that those are quite good units there. Now, if I wanted to, I could go down a route where I'm using the tanks instead of those guys. It's a little bit more offense orientated. It becomes really hard to kill them. So in this case, I wouldn't bother going with the reflective reactive armor or whatever. Realistically speaking, if you build a tank using this sort of composition, if the enemy is sort of shooting at your tank there and getting quantum avatared all over the place, they're kind of going to be screwed because they're not going to be able to properly fire at it. So they'll probably just get bounced around a little bit, deal very little damage, and then end up staggered. And at that point in time, the tank can just counterattack because they've had their unit sort of flipped around all over the place by random luck. You could also go with the walkers, same sort of thing there. It can also have the quantum avatar if you're going more the kinetic route there. I definitely think there's some ways that you could go with the walkers and kind of have them be like the Rift Generator Light there, in that the upgraded strike missile's got good range, it's got good damage, it's got a decent ability to disrupt a group of enemies there. It's not quite as good as the ability that the Rift Generators have, where they randomly turn the enemy around so they're facing backwards. I think that just makes them a little bit better, and also also the ability to take a scary unit just completely out of the fight there. Quite strong. Drone carrier, the problem is that Quantum Avatar doesn't carry over to the drones, so that's why I would say that the carrier is not as good a synergy as Pain Mirror from Cynumbra. So I think that there's not much sort of going on with that particular combination. So anyway, that is pretty much everything to say about the different units and stuff like that. Oh, I guess I should mention as well, I don't find that very many of the combat-based operations for Voidtech are as powerful as the Vanguard ones. The more I've been playing this, the more I've been coming to appreciate that the Vanguard abilities here are really, really powerful. Nanite support, just early game, is absolutely vital to those early game fights there. Using the Nanite support station to keep your units basically full health as well as heavily covered is just a fantastic way to make sure that your composition is going through the early game basically seamlessly. Deploy Valkyrie is just probably overpowered. The fact that you deal a little bit of damage on landing, but then you get an additional attack right away, or the ability to do an area of effect blind with more stagger is already good. But then the fact that you get a unit that stays on the table after that with a jetpack that can sort of rocket into a position where they can flank someone and chop them down with their laser sword on the second turn of being around, for fairly cheap is just ridiculously good. This is probably one of the best call-ins in the game. And then you've also got access to the heavy launcher turret, which is also really, really strong. I personally think the Valkyrie is just a little bit more reliably good, but there are a ton of situations where the heavy launcher turret is just a fantastic addition. In addition, when you're attacking out the enemy there, things like the orbital laser cannon and supply drop are really fantastic on a push there. There's nothing in Voidtech that really feels like it matches up to those. There are certain things like time rewind that are situationally pretty good there, but dimensional collapse, for example, is an example of something where I would much rather use relativistic projectiles for the mass driver cannon. This has got a lower chance of killing the individual target, because once you fail to kill, this one only is strength 25, whereas the other one is strength 30, so less damage, but it's only 5 less damage, and this one's an area of effect one that causes massive impact in a radius around it. So I generally speaking think that mass driver cannon is just a bit stronger than dimensional collapse. It's only 1 tactical point cheaper to cast dimensional collapse, so dimensional vortex bomb I think is actually really, really lousy. Yeah, it's just, I think that generally speaking, you're going to be relying more on the Vanguard for operations, and that's fine, because the Voidtech having really, really powerful Echo Walkers, as well as the really powerful Rift Generator and really powerful late game mod there, means that you need something else to sort of get you to that state where you can use those sort of things effectively. And for Vanguard, it really is going to be things like early deploy Valkyrie and stuff like that. It's going to help you dominate the game in that early portion in a way that you probably wouldn't be able to with another faction. So anyway, that is going to be all of those. Now let's get back to looking at the actual units here, or stacks here. So I got a random stack over here at home. This one's just got a standard character here. I do actually have the ability to put this one onto like a chopper or something like that, or potentially the tank later, but haven't gotten around to that one just yet. We don't have a ton of resources right now, as you'll notice. But these are the main stacks that we're sort of going on that push here. We've got our hero here, who is in a Rift Tank with the Stasis Pocket Inducer, the Nanite Injectors, and the Quantum Avatar, doing what I was mentioning them doing, just being very disruptive and using a lot of crowd control. We've got 3 of the Echo Walkers, and we've got a couple of the Troopers. We've actually lost quite a lot of troops along this march here, but we've taken over quite a lot of terrain here without reinforcing all that much there. So we used to have 3 full stacks there. I lost an entire stack's worth. This is why we've got 2 heroes in this one. Got a random engineer, just random stuff that we get kicking around. Always use just every unit that you've got here. There's no point in not bringing along units when you've got the opportunity to. Even if they don't really fit into the composition there, it's better to have them than to not have them. At least the very, very least is they can get shot at by the enemy instead of something else that's more important. So these are sort of what we're doing for our stacks there. We've got our hero sort of being the tank support sort of stuff like that. Got some Echo Walkers, which are capable of causing some major havoc and disruption and damage there. Now, I was trying to make sure I was using lots of Echo Walkers in this game. If you see that Growth is one of the NPC factions, I would actually recommend not going heavy on the Echo Walkers. The reason for this is that Growth provides the ability to get those tier 2 Bs, the Green Hornets or whatever. I can't remember where they are on this map here. Let's see if I can find their stupid town. Yeah, so if we take a look here, Soldier Bees here, this unit is actually really quite good at countering Voidtech. Corrosive Spit's a pretty powerful ability there. It removes armor on a hit there. The ability to deal that sting there is quite a lot of damage there, as well as being able to drain some life. Now, generally speaking, the way that you would use these guys against Voidtech is you'd spread them out quite a bit, and you just sort of have them modded up so that they regenerate and that they've got durability and they've got dodge. If they can get around so that they are hitting the tanks from behind, it doesn't matter as much that they're getting jostled around as much, because they're going to be dealing pretty hefty damage per shot there. Corrosive Spit's a pretty deadly attack there, and since the Echo Walkers can't attack them at all, they're pretty much able to sort of free reign around the map there. It's kind of annoying there. I believe that this also had the ability to clear off status effects there, but I can't remember. No, I think that must be probably Xenoplague. Anyway, so yeah, like those things can provide a real hard counter to your stacks in this particular case, because they just pick off the couple units that can fire upwards. Once those units are dead, you're basically screwed. So you got to be sort of a little bit careful about what you're sort of doing here. Anyway, that is going to be our video for today there. Hope you found this episode enjoyable. And as always, hope to see you guys all next time. If you're wondering, this is again another game that's on extreme. It doesn't look from the timer here that we're going to win, but the reason that we do win when I hit next turn in this particular case is that the AI is going to ask me to form an alliance with it, and once we form that alliance, we win the game, since we're the only two factions left in the game there. So anyway, I'll see you guys all next time.